They laughed at him when he walked into the showroom, but they had no idea who he really was. A humble black farmer, dressed in worn boots and a dusty hat, stepped into a luxurious jet dealership. The polished floor reflected his every move, but instead of respect, whispers of mockery filled the air. Salesmen smirked, customers sneered, convinced he didn't belong. What happened next would shatter every prejudice in that room. The farmer entered quietly, asking about a private jet. The salesman chuckled, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Sir, these aren't tractors, they're jets. Maybe you'd like to look at the brochures instead." The room echoed with laughter. Yet the farmer's calm eyes carried a silent strength, refusing to bow to humiliation. He stood there, weathered hat in his hand, his boots carrying the dust of long days in the fields, but his posture was unshaken. Every wrinkle on his face told a story of toil under the sun, of hands hardened by plowing soil, of a life built on resilience rather than privilege. The eyes of the people around him bore down on him with ridicule, as if his very presence in that glossy showroom was an insult to their sense of who deserved luxury. But he did not move back. He took a quiet breath and let the sting of their laughter pass through him. For he had known worse humiliations in life and survived each one. The salesman leaned casually against the desk, adjusting his shiny tie, smirking at the farmer's rugged clothes. "You see, these planes cost millions. They're not for people like you," he said, letting the words hang in the air, heavy with condescension. A couple nearby glanced over, suppressing laughter, whispering cruel jokes under their breath. To them, the farmer looked like a misplaced soul, a man who belonged with livestock and hay bales, not among polished steel and champagne-scented deals. Yet, the farmer said nothing. He looked at the aircraft models gleaming under the showroom lights, his gaze steady, unhurried, carrying the patience of someone who had seen seasons change and crops rise after storms. For a moment, his mind drifted back to his land, the endless fields stretching beyond the horizon. Green seas of crops swaying with the wind, the scent of soil that clung to him as an identity. He remembered the mornings when he woke before dawn, guiding his sons through the frost-covered earth, teaching them how to respect the land. That soil, rich and stubborn, had provided for his family for generations, and in return, he had given it everything. His sweat, his strength, his years. What the world saw as roughness was, in truth, a crown forged by labor. And though the men in suits could not see it, he carried a wealth that could not be measured only in money. It was a wealth of dignity, perseverance, and quiet triumphs against every obstacle laid in his path. But this day was not about proving his worth to them. He had not come to beg for their approval. He had come because he had earned it, because the fruits of his harvest and the wisdom of his labor had granted him the freedom to dream beyond boundaries others had set for him. He let the salesman's words hang, allowed the sneers and chuckles to echo. Then, in a voice calm yet firm, he said, "I didn't come here to look at brochures. I came to buy." The laughter in the room faltered for a second, as if disbelief fought against curiosity. The salesman blinked, searching for words, then shook his head, convinced this was nothing but a joke. "Sir, these jets are for clients who have certain standards. I don't think you quite understand the level of commitment required," the salesman said, drawing out each word like a blade, cutting into the air between them. But the farmer simply walked forward, his boots thudding softly on the polished floor. He set his briefcase on the desk, and with deliberate calm, he opened it. Inside lay neatly arranged documents, land ownership deeds, stretching back decades, harvest records showing yields worth millions, and bank statements that reflected a fortune built from earth itself. The salesman's smirk dissolved, his face tightening as his eyes darted across the papers. The silence in the room deepened, the whispers fading into stunned stillness. The farmer did not smile, nor did he gloat. His dignity did not need the fuel of revenge. Instead, he said softly, "This land has fed thousands. It has given more than any man could count, and it has given me enough to buy not one, but many of these jets. I am not here for your approval. I am here for what I have earned." The weight of his words filled the room with an uncomfortable truth, pressing down on every person who had laughed. For the first time, their eyes shifted, no longer mocking but searching for a place to hide their shame. The salesman swallowed, his arrogance crumbling into nervous politeness. "Of course, sir, I didn't realize. Forgive me, please. Let's discuss which model might best suit your needs." His tone had shifted, no longer laced with scorn but dripping with desperation to mend the insult he had thrown. Yet the farmer only gave him a long, quiet look, the kind that stripped away every layer of pretense. He pointed at the largest, most gleaming jet on display, the kind reserved for celebrities, billionaires, and royalty. "That one," he said simply. "Prepare the paperwork." The room watched in awe as the salesman scrambled, fumbling with forms, his hands trembling under the weight of his earlier arrogance. The farmer signed without hesitation, each stroke of his pen a silent declaration that worth is not defined by appearance, that dignity cannot be bought or mocked away. He did not ask for respect, he commanded it, without raising his voice, without breaking his calm. The transaction was completed swiftly, but the lesson it left behind lingered like a scar on every conscience present. As he walked out, keys in hand, his back straight and step steady, the same people who had mocked him now avoided his gaze. Their laughter had been silenced, replaced by an unspoken recognition of the strength they had failed to see. Outside, the sun caught the brim of his hat, and for a moment, he looked less like a farmer and more like a king returning to his kingdom. The world had tried to belittle him, but he had risen above, not with fury, but with grace. What no one in that showroom knew was that this jet was not just a purchase, it was a symbol. For years he had battled against prejudice, against banks that once denied him loans, against markets that undervalued his crops, against neighbors who doubted he could rise. Each insult had become a stone in his foundation, each struggle a chapter in his story of survival. The jet was not a toy, it was a testament to a journey that began with a boy working barefoot in fields, dreaming of a life where no man could question his place. And as the engines of his new jet roared for the first time, he thought, not of revenge but of his ancestors, those who had worked the land before him, those who had endured chains and humiliation, so that he could stand here free and unbroken. He carried them with him in that moment, lifting not only himself but generations who had been denied the chance to dream so boldly. His purchase was their victory, his flight was their liberation, and his dignity was their vindication. In the silence that followed his departure, the salesman slumped into his chair, haunted by the memory of his own laughter. The lesson was carved deep: never judge a man by the dust on his boots, for beneath that dust may lie a fortune, a legacy, and a spirit stronger than steel. The farmer's story would ripple beyond that showroom, whispered as a tale of justice, of humility, and of quiet triumph. And though the world may still laugh at men like him, they would never again forget the day a farmer walked in and bought a jet with the strength of his soul and the wealth of his labor. Minutes later, he placed a weathered briefcase on the desk. Inside lay documents of vast land ownership, thriving crops, and generational success. The salesman froze. This man wasn't just a farmer, he was one of the wealthiest landowners in the state. Silence swallowed the room as the truth erased every trace of mockery. For a long moment, the glossy walls of the jet showroom seemed to hum with stillness, as if even the luxury engines on display had quieted themselves to bear witness to what had just been revealed. The laughter that had once filled the air, the sneering comments and the dismissive glances, evaporated into a heavy shame that sat on the chests of everyone who had judged him. The farmer did not smile in triumph. He did not gloat or even raise his chin to flaunt his victory. He simply stood there, hat resting on the table beside the open briefcase, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. His expression remained calm, steady, almost unshaken by the shift in the atmosphere. It was as though he had been expecting this exact reaction, as if he had lived through such moments too many times before. His silence carried more weight than any words could have, for it reminded every person in that room that dignity does not need to announce itself. The salesman's face, once painted with smug superiority, turned pale. His confident smirk cracked and fell away, replaced with stammering uncertainty. His eyes darted between the papers, the property deeds, the tax records, the bank letters that bore figures far beyond what he had ever expected from this rugged man in boots. He swallowed hard, his throat tightening with the realization that he had not just underestimated a client, he had insulted a legacy. The documents spoke louder than the farmer ever could. Acres upon acres of fertile land sprawled across maps, marked with bold signatures and legal stamps. There were letters of recognition from agricultural boards, awards for innovation in sustainable farming, and acknowledgments from banks that had once doubted him, but now clamored to work with him. The salesman's hand trembled as he reached for one of the sheets, tracing the figures, the endless rows of assets that added up to a fortune greater than he could have imagined. He remembered how just moments ago he had laughed, how he had leaned against his desk with the arrogance of a man who believed he held power simply because he wore a tailored suit and worked in a polished showroom. And now, confronted with the truth, he felt smaller than the dust that clung to the farmer's boots. Around them, the other customers who had sneered began to shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Some looked away, pretending to study the glossy magazines on the coffee table. Others cleared their throats, their earlier whispers now burning in their minds like echoes of guilt. No one dared to laugh now. No one dared to meet the farmer's eyes. But the farmer's eyes, steady and deep, seemed to look past them all, as though he saw something far greater than the walls that contained them. Perhaps he was seeing his father's hands, calloused and rough, guiding his own smaller hands through the soil when he was just a boy. Perhaps he was seeing his mother, who had carried water in buckets across fields, humming songs of resilience while the sun scorched her back. Perhaps he was seeing his grandparents, who had endured the cruelest forms of prejudice, denied opportunities and dignity, yet who had tilled the earth with unyielding faith that one day the seeds they planted would grow into something more than just crops. Generational success. That was what the documents represented, not just wealth, but a lineage of perseverance. Each page was a story of survival and triumph, each signature a testament to sacrifices made so that he could stand here today. The salesman could not see those faces, but the farmer felt them all around him. Their presence gave him strength, and their sacrifices gave him the right to stand in this showroom without shame, without apology. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, deep, and steady. "This land," he said, gesturing gently toward the papers, "has fed thousands. It has raised families. It has given me everything I needed and more. And yet, when I walked in here, all you saw was the dirt on my boots." His words cut through the silence like a blade, sharp but not shouted, heavy but not cruel. They lingered in the air, demanding reflection from every soul present. The salesman opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. His polished, rehearsed pitches, the clever lines he often used to impress wealthy clients, all crumbled under the weight of truth. What could he say? That he was sorry, that he had made a mistake. The apologies felt too small, too inadequate in the face of the humiliation he had caused. The farmer looked at him, then at the jet across the showroom floor, the sleek silver aircraft that had caught his attention from the beginning. "That one," he said simply, pointing to the largest jet. His tone was final, unshakable. "Prepare the paperwork." The salesman hesitated, still reeling from the shock, but then hurried to comply. His hands fumbled as he gathered the contracts, his pen slipping between nervous fingers. The arrogance that once dripped from his every move had vanished, replaced with a nervous eagerness to please. He was no longer in control. The farmer had taken that power the moment he opened his briefcase. As the paperwork was laid out, the farmer signed with quiet confidence. Each stroke of his pen was deliberate, steady, as though he were planting seeds into the soil of history. Around him, the other customers watched, unable to tear their eyes away. What they saw was not just a transaction, it was a transformation of perception, a moment where prejudice was shattered by truth. Yet the farmer did not pause to revel in their shock. He did not look around to savor their silence. For him, this moment was not about proving them wrong. It was about living true to himself, honoring the labor that had brought him here, and ensuring that the legacy of his family would never again be underestimated. When the deal was finalized, the salesman extended his hand, his smile forced and uneasy. The farmer looked at it for a moment, then shook it, his grip firm but not vindictive. It was not forgiveness, it was a statement that he was above bitterness. He carried himself with a grace that no insult could stain. As he gathered his papers and closed his briefcase, he placed his weathered hat back on his head. The brim cast a shadow over his eyes, but beneath it, there was a quiet fire, a dignity that needed no recognition from anyone else. He turned toward the exit, his boots clicking softly on the polished floor. Each step echoed with finality, leaving behind an unspoken lesson carved into the hearts of all who had witnessed the scene. Outside, the sunlight greeted him warmly, as though the world itself recognized the weight of his triumph. The air was fresher, freer, untainted by the sneers and whispers that had filled the showroom. For him, the purchase of the jet was not a trophy, it was a symbol of resilience. It was proof that no matter how many times he had been doubted, dismissed, or demeaned, he had risen above. He thought of his children, of how they would see their father not only as a farmer, but as a man who could walk into any room, no matter how hostile, and command respect without demanding it. He thought of his ancestors, whose backs had bent under injustice, and he felt their spirits standing taller now, carried upward by his quiet victory. And somewhere, deep within, he hoped the salesman and every other person who had mocked him that day would remember this moment, not as a humiliation for themselves, but as a lesson never to judge a man by the clothes on his back or the dirt on his hands, for true wealth lies in resilience, in perseverance, and in the unbreakable dignity of a soul that refuses to bow. The farmer walked on, the keys to his new jet in his hand, but in truth, he carried something far greater. He carried the weight of a history rewritten, of a narrative transformed, and of a truth too powerful to be silenced. That dignity cannot be bought, mocked, or diminished. It's earned, and once earned, it shines brighter than any jet in the sky. The farmer didn't raise his voice or show anger. Instead, he chose the largest jet on the floor, signed the deal, and walked away with quiet dignity. The same men who laughed were left speechless, realizing too late that true wealth isn't just money, it's resilience, pride, and the grace to rise above hate. The sound of his boots against the polished floor echoed louder than any words he might have spoken, and in those echoes, the room heard a truth more powerful than fury could ever convey. The laughter had drained from their faces, replaced with a silence so sharp it cut deeper than shame. They had mocked the dirt on his hands, the creases in his clothes, the humility in his manner, but in the end, he had carried something they could never possess, a soul untarnished by arrogance. He paused at the door for a brief moment, not to gloat, not to relish the stunned faces behind him, but to take in the stillness that had replaced their mockery. In his heart, he was not thinking of them at all. His mind had already traveled back to the land that had shaped him, the endless fields swaying in the wind, the sweat dripping down his brow as he plowed row after row, the mornings when he woke before dawn to ensure the day's harvest would provide for his family. That soil had never laughed at him. That sun had never questioned his worth. Nature had always been honest, rewarding his labor with crops, punishing neglect with famine, yet always teaching him that dignity is born in effort, not appearances. The pen he had just used to sign the deal still carried the scent of fresh ink, but for him, it smelled of seeds planted long ago. The jet was not merely a machine of steel and wings, it was a symbol of how far he had come, of how every drop of sweat, every calloused hand, every sacrifice had accumulated into this moment of quiet triumph. He had not come to the showroom to prove a point. He had come because he had earned the right to dream beyond the horizons of his fields. The men behind him shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering in tones that carried regret and confusion. "How could we have known?" one muttered. Another shook his head, as though trying to erase the memory of his own cruel laughter. But the truth was undeniable. They had judged him not by who he was, but by what they assumed he could never be. And in doing so, they had revealed not his weakness, but their own. The salesman, now pale and sweating, fumbled with the papers he had hastily gathered. He replayed every word he had said, every smirk, every mocking glance, and with each memory, the weight of shame grew heavier on his shoulders. The image of the farmer's calm face, unshaken by insult, burned in his mind. He realized that he had not merely underestimated a man, he had humiliated himself. The farmer walked into the sunlight outside, the doors closing softly behind him. The world felt brighter, freer, as though the very air had conspired to remind him that he was no longer bound by the judgments of small men. He looked at the sky, imagining the roar of his new jet cutting through the clouds, a sound that would carry his story far beyond these walls. For him, the flight would not just be a journey across miles, it would be a journey across generations, lifting the dreams of his ancestors into the heavens. He remembered his grandfather, who had tilled the soil with bare hands, denied opportunities because of the color of his skin, mocked by those who believed farming was all he would ever know. He remembered his father, who fought for every acre, every chance to prove that the land was not just dirt but wealth, if one had the will to nurture it. He remembered his mother, who carried buckets of water across fields while humming songs of hope, teaching him that dignity was not given, it was carried inside and never surrendered. And he thought of his children, who would now see not just a farmer, but a man who could walk into any room, stand in the face of scorn, and leave with his head held high. The jet gleamed in his mind as more than a machine. It was freedom, it was proof. It was the embodiment of his life's work, silent yet undeniable, powerful yet graceful. He imagined the first time he would sit inside, the leather seats beneath him, the engines roaring to life, lifting him above the fields he had once walked barefoot as a child. And yet, he knew he would never forget the soil, the dust, the roots that grounded him. Inside the showroom the silence stretched on. Customers who had once mocked now shifted in their chairs, staring at the floor as if searching for excuses. But excuses would not save them. They had witnessed something rare: humility wrapped in strength, patience wrapped in power, and they knew they would never forget the day a farmer, clad in dust and dignity, had walked into their world of polished glass and steel and turned it upside down without raising his voice. The salesman sat at his desk long after the farmer had gone, staring at the empty doorway. He thought of all the wealthy clients he had served, men in designer suits, women draped in jewels, people who flaunted their wealth like a shield, yet none of them had ever left an impression as profound as the man who wore boots still caked with soil. He realized then that wealth without humility is hollow, but humility with wealth becomes unshakable. The farmer, now standing by his truck outside, placed his briefcase on the seat and rested his hat on the dashboard. He leaned against the vehicle for a moment, closing his eyes as the breeze swept past him. He did not feel anger toward those who had mocked him. He felt only a quiet resolve, a reminder that the world would always carry prejudice, but he would always carry something stronger: resilience. He drove away slowly, the city roads giving way to the open fields. As the skyline faded behind him, he felt a deep peace settle in his chest. The jet was his now, but more importantly, so was the story. He imagined telling it to his children, to his grandchildren, not with bitterness but with pride. He would tell them that dignity is not something others can give or take, it is something you carry, no matter where you go. And when the day came for him to step into that jet, to rise above the clouds, he would do so not as a man who had conquered others, but as a man who had conquered himself, his doubts, his struggles, his hardships. He would fly for the generations before him who had been denied the chance, and for the generations after him who would never again doubt their worth. The men in that showroom would talk about him for years. Some would tell the story with shame, admitting their mistake. Others would embellish, pretending they had known all along, but deep down they would all remember the same truth, that they had laughed at a man who had more wealth than they could imagine, not in his wallet alone but in his spirit. And they would remember how he left without anger, how he rose above their hate with grace. That grace would linger, echoing louder than the roar of his jet, reminding them that true wealth isn't measured in money or machines, but in the ability to rise when others try to push you down, to walk with dignity when others try to strip it away, and to forgive without forgetting. The farmer, now back on his land, stood at the edge of his fields, watching the crops sway in the wind. He smiled softly, knowing that this was where his true wealth lay: in the soil, in the work, in the legacy. The jet would carry him far, but the land would always bring him home, and in that balance he found his peace. He didn't need the world's applause. He didn't need their validation. He had his land, his family, his dignity, and, now, his freedom. And as the sun dipped low across the horizon, casting golden light over his fields, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: the laughter of small men could never overshadow the legacy of a great one.